Welcome to the second part of my Ultimate React Native course. In the first part, we covered the fundamentals. In this part, we're going to talk about the advanced concepts. You will learn about using native device features, implementing navigation, networking, adding offline support, authentication and authorization, sending and receiving push notifications, and distributing your apps to real devices and app stores. So there is a lot we're going to cover over the next few hours. I'm going to share a lot of tips and tricks with you, and I promise, by the end of this course, you're going to be a React Native ninja. I worked really hard on this course, and the only thing that truly satisfies me is hearing your success story. So after you finish this course, if you build an app or get a job, please send me a tweet and share your success story with me. I can't wait to hear from you. Now let's jump in and get started. Let's talk about what you need to know to take this course. First, this course is the second part of my React Native series. You're welcome to start right here if you have some experience with React Native, but ideally you should have watched the first part, because in that part, we covered a lot of ground and built a big chunk of our app, which we're going to use in this course. So here I'm not going to explain the code that we wrote in the first part. You should already know what we've built. Second, you need to be fairly familiar with React hooks and context. You don't need to be an expert, but you need to know the basics, such as the state and effect hooks. I've covered hooks and context in the recent update I made to my React course. It's the last section of the course. So if you're not familiar with these topics, go watch that section. You should also be fairly comfortable with modern JavaScript features, such as arrow functions, spread operator, promises, async and await, and so on. We'll be using a lot of async and await in this course. So if you don't know what they are and how they work, you really need to go back and revisit these topics before taking this course. With all that, are you the right student for this course or not? I hope you are, so let's move forward. In this course, I'm going to use VS Code or Visual Studio Code, but you can use any editor you want. That's entirely up to you. But if you use VS Code, I want you to download the code snippet I've added below this video. With this snippet, we can quickly generate a function component for React Native. So if you type RNFC, which is short for React Native Function Component, we get this basic template, which includes a function component, a view, and our stylus object. So download the JSON file below this video. In this JSON file, you'll find a key value pair like this. So we have function component. Here's the prefix or the shortcut for activating this snippet. When we type RNFC, we get this template. Now let me show you where to add this in VS Code. On the top, go to the code menu. If you're on Windows, this is probably called File. Then go to Preferences and User Snippets. Here search for javascript.json. This file contains all the code snippets for JavaScript files. You might already have a few snippets there, so don't delete anything. Just go to the JSON file that I've provided and copy this key value pair, function component, copy this entire thing, and add it to your JSON file. Then, once you save the changes, you'll be able to create a function component by typing RNFC. In this section, you're going to learn how to access native device features. As part of this, we're going to take our app to the next level. So now we can add images to our listing. When we post this listing, we're going to include these images and the user's location. I'm super excited about this section. I hope you are too. So let's jump in and get started. In this lesson, I'm going to give you an overview of using native device features in your React Native apps. So React Native itself doesn't give us much in terms of accessing these native device features. Here on React Native website, under Core APIs, you can see we have very few APIs for working with these native features. For example, we can display an alert, we can work with the soft keyboard, and so on. The other functions like camera, contacts, and location are not available in the core of React Native. They're available as third-party libraries. For example, we have this image picker from React Native community. With this, we can select an image from the device library or the camera. Now, most of these components require additional setup in the native iOS and Android project. For example, look at the installation instructions here. So first, we have to install this library using npm or yarn, but then we have to run this command in our iOS project. So we cannot use this library with Expo because we don't have access to those native projects. So here we have two options. We can eject from Expo to get full access to the underlying native project, or we can use the components provided by Expo, which is what I prefer at this point, because Expo simplifies a lot of things. So I want to keep using it as much as we can. So don't avoid it just because someone like this guy told you that Expo is crap. It's not. It's a great productivity tool. With Expo, we can get more done in less time. Now let's see what native features Expo gives us. So we go to docs.expo.io. Under API reference, here on the left, you can see all the components we can use in our apps. We can access the calendar, camera, contacts, and so on. These components are super easy to use and are perfectly documented. I love them. In this section, I'm going to show you how to use the image picker. Using other components is very similar, so there is no point me showing you how to use every individual component. You can learn that on your own. So before going forward, it's good to pause this video, have a quick look at the list of components that are available to you. We have lots of native features here, and this list keeps growing because Expo is under active development. So next I'm going to show you how to use the image picker. Here's the documentation for the image picker component in Expo. With this, we can select an image or a video from the user's library or from the camera. Now, all these components have this platform compatibility table. So as you can see, this component is supported on all these platforms. Some of these components are only available on a real device. We cannot use them in a simulator. So before using a component, always have a quick look at this table. Now look at the installation instructions. All we have to do is to run this command in the terminal window. As simple as that. There are no additional steps that we need to follow. Now over here, the documentation is saying that if you're installing this in a bare React Native app, that means a React Native app without Expo. Then we have to follow these additional installation instructions. So that means if we use this component now, and then tomorrow we decide to eject from Expo, we have to perform these additional steps. Let's have a quick look. Look, for iOS, we have to go to this file, info.plist, which is short for property list. Here we have to add a couple of lines, a key value pair, and then run npx pod install. For Android, we have to do a similar configuration. Now, this is not too bad, but sometimes components provided by third-party libraries require some more configuration. Now, back to Expo documentation. All these components have a working example. Again, they're perfectly documented. You can see all the methods available in their API. You can see their parameters, their return types, and so on. We have perfect documentation here. That is why I love Expo. A lot of third-party libraries out there are poorly documented and they're not under active development. So if they have a bug, you're on your own. So here in the terminal window, let's run expo install expo-image-picker. All right, our image picker component is installed. Now, whenever we want to access sensitive information on the user's device, like their location or images, we have to request their permission. We'll talk about that next. Let's see how we can get the user's permission. So in app.js, I'm simply returning the screen component that we built in the first part of this course. For now, we want to take a break from our app and study the image picker in isolation. So when our component gets rendered, we want to get the user's permission. In class components, we have the component didMount method. But in function components, we don't have this method. Here we have to use the effect hook. At this point, you need to be familiar with this concept. So I'm going to call the effect hook, give it a function. Now, as you know, this function that we pass here gets executed every time our component gets rendered. Now, in this case, we don't want to keep asking the user's permission. We want to do this only the first time our component gets rendered. How do we do this? Well, this useEffect function has an optional second parameter, which is an array of dependencies. We can pass a bunch of variables here. Now, anytime any of these variables changes, this function will get re-executed. Now, what if we pass an empty array? That means this function will get executed only once because it's not dependent to any variables. We have no dependency here. So the code that we write here will be equivalent to the code in component didMount. Okay? Now we want to get the user's permission. So on the top, we import everything as image picker from expo-image picker. Now, this image picker object has a bunch of useful properties and methods. Look, all of these are perfectly documented. In this lesson, we're going to use the request method. We can request camera permission or camera roll permission, which is the library. So let's call this method. As you can see from the name, this is an async method, so we need to await it to get the result. So when the promise is resolved, we're going to get this result object. Now, because we have used await here, we have to mark this function as async, but now we have a problem. If we run our app, we're going to get a warning because we cannot pass an async function to the effect hook. Here's the reason. When we mark this function as async, implicitly it returns a promise. So even though we don't have an explicit return statement here, implicitly a promise will be returned. Now the useEffect function cannot accept a function that returns a promise. Here we can only return a function. This function will be used for cleaning up. So when our component is going to get unmounted, this function is going to get executed. That is the reason why we cannot return a promise here. So to solve this problem, I'm going to move this logic inside a separate function. So let's define a function. We can call that request permission. This is an async function. Now, we're going to move this logic over here. Okay? Now back to the useEffect function. We're going to remove the async. And here we just call request permission. Note that I'm not awaiting this call, because if you await this, we have to mark this as async, and it doesn't work. So here we're simply calling an async function and moving on. We are not waiting for the result of this function, okay? Now, back to our request permission function. Now, this result object has a bunch of properties like can ask again, expires, granted, and status. Granted is a Boolean property. So if it's false, we're going to display an alert and say, you need to enable permission to access the library. Now here we can improve this code and use object destructuring. Because we only need the granted property, we can destructure this object and pick this property and then use it over here. That's simpler. Now let's test our app. So save the changes. Okay, we get this dialog box. Expo would like access to your photos. Now in the future, when we build a standalone app, Expo will be replaced with the name of our app, okay? Now, whatever we set here will be remembered by the device, so the next time we run our app, we're not going to get this dialog box. And that means when we call the request method, we're going to get the answer immediately, okay? Now let's set this to don't allow. We get this alert, you need to enable permissions, okay? Let's reload the app. Look, this time we didn't get that dialog box, we got the answer immediately. So we're telling the user they have to enable permissions to use this feature. Now, on iPhone, we can go to the settings, and over here we have Expo. Look at the permissions for photos. It's set to never. Let's change this to read and write. Now, back to our app. We get this dialog box, experience needs permissions. The messaging is changed. I'm not entirely sure why, but this is not something you need to worry about. So let's allow permissions. Now, if we reload our app, we don't see an alert anymore. So this is how we can get the user's permission. Now, there's another way to do this using the permissions API. We'll talk about that next. Let's see how we can use the permissions API to get the user's permission. So here in the terminal window, we type expo install expo-permissions. This package gives us a bunch of objects for working with permissions. All right, we have installed expo permissions. Now back to our code. On the top, we're going to import everything as permissions from expo-permissions. Now here in our request permission function, we can call permissions.ask async and give it one or more permission types. So this permissions object has a bunch of properties for various permissions. We have audio recording, calendar, camera, camera roll, and so on. So here I'm going to pass camera roll. Now what we have on this line is identical to the request method. So the request method internally uses the permissions API. Which approach you choose is entirely up to you. But here with Permissions API, we can pass multiple permission types. For example, we can pass a second permission type, let's say location, and with this, the user is going to get two different dialog boxes. Now, similar to the request method, this method also returns an object, so we have to await it to get the result. Now here we have the same properties. So if granted returns true, that means the user gave all these permissions. If they reject at least one permission, then granted is going to return false. So this is how we can use the Permissions API. Going forward, I'm going to use the request method, so we don't need these two lines. So now that you know how to get the user's permission, let's see how we can select an image from the library. Now to select an image from the user's library, I'm going to add a button. Let's set the title to Select Image and onPress to a function called Select Image. Now let's implement this function. So Select Image is a function. In this function, we're going to call ImagePicker.launch image library async. This is going to bring up the image library window where the user can select an image. Once again, we have an async function, so we have to await it to get the result. And we should make this async as well. Now, it is possible that while reading this image, something goes wrong. It's very unlikely, but to be on the safe side, we should wrap this line inside a try-catch block. So here we type try. Now look at this item, try-catch with this square icon. This is a code snippet built into VS Code. So let's press enter. Now we have a try-catch block, so we can move this line over here. Now in our catch block, for now, we're just going to do a console.log and say error reading an image. Now this result object has a few properties. You can read about them on the documentation. They're perfectly documented. In this video, we're going to talk about two of these properties. Cancelled, which is a Boolean property. If the user doesn't select an image, cancelled returns true. We also have URI, which is the full path to the image. We're going to use this property to render an image on the screen. So first, let's add an image. We're going to set the source prop to an object with the URI property. Now we should set this to the URI of this result object. Now to make this work, we have to declare a state variable in this component. When we read an image, we set that state variable and then reference it over here. So let's use the state hook to declare a variable. We're going to call that image URI, and the function to update it, we're going to call that set image URI. Now, when we read an image, first we check result.cancel. So if the user doesn't cancel, then we're going to call set image URI and give it result.URI. Now, we go to our image and set the URI to image URI. For this demo, I would like to apply a width and height to this image as well. So let's set the width to 200 and height to 200 as well. Now let's test our implementation. So save the changes and take a look. Here's our button. If I cancel, nothing happens. But if I select an image, the image appears here. So as you see, using native features is really easy with Expo. We just have to install a library, then import an object and call a couple of methods. As simple as that. Let me give you a quick overview of what we're going to build and how we're going to build it. So now we have this new component for selecting a new image. We can add a new image. If we tap on an existing image, we can delete it. Now when we post this form to the server, these images, their URIs will also be sent to the server. Here we also have validation. So if I remove this image and then try to post this form, we get this error. Please select at least one image. So this is what I want you to build as an exercise. Now let me give you a tip on how to solve this problem. Whenever you want to solve a problem, always try to break it down into a series of simpler, smaller, and more manageable problems. So to implement this new feature, first forget about the listing edit form. Imagine it doesn't exist. So build and test this component in isolation outside of the listing edit form. Use it in the app component. With that component, make sure you can select a single image. Just a single image, not multiple images. So we can select an image, and that image should appear in this container. Don't worry about adding this new container or placeholder for selecting a new image. Now, when we tap on this image, it should be deleted. So that is the main or the base component you should build. Let's call that image input. So just like we have text input, we can have an image input. Once you build that component, once it's working, then build a new component called image input list. This component has the list functionality. So with that component, we can add multiple images. Again, build and test this component in isolation outside of the listing edit form. Once you get it working, then add that component to the listing edit form to implement validation. So think of this as a series of baby steps. Now download the PDF I've attached to this lesson. There you can find more details about these exercises. So these exercises I've designed for you are fantastic. You're going to learn a lot from them. So now stop watching and work these exercises, then come back see my solution over the next few videos. I'm going to show you some extra tips and tricks along the way. Let's start with our image input component. So here in the components folder, let's add a new file, imageinput.js. Here I'm going to use the code snippet that I gave you at the beginning of the course. So RNFC is short for React Native Function Component. Beautiful. We have a template for creating a new component. In this component, we have a view that acts as a container. So let's give this container a bunch of styles. I'm going to set the background color to, look, we can auto import our colors palette and set the background to colors.light. I'm also going to give it a border radius of 15 pixels so we get round corners. Now, if we don't have an image, we want to show a camera icon in the center of this container. So here we should set two more properties, justify content and align items. Now I'm going to move align items to the top. So all these properties are sorted. This makes it easier to read this code. Finally, I want to set the height to 100 pixels and the width to 100 pixels as well. Now in the future, we can change this and set the size dynamically. For now, let's not worry about it. So save. Let's test our implementation. So we go to app.js and render an image input. Take a look. So here's our container. Now let's render an icon in the center of this container. So we go to our component. On the top, we import from @expo/vector icons. We're going to import material community icons. Now I'm going to give this component a new prop called image URI. If we don't have an image, we want to render the camera icon. So here we're going to use conditional rendering. If image URI doesn't exist, then we're going to render an icon. Let's set the name to camera, the size to 40, and the color to colors.medium. Let's test our app. Here's the icon, beautiful. Now if you have an image, we want to show that image inside this container. So one more time, conditional rendering. If image URI exists, then we're going to render an image component. Here we're going to set the source to an object with the URI property set to image URI. Now we should also set a style here. So style is styles.image. Now, what styles do we need for this image? We want the image to fill its container. So we set the width and height to 100%. Now to test this, we go to app.js and set image URI to our state variable. Take a look. So I'm going to select an image. Okay, here's the image, but we lost the round corners. I explained why this happens in the first part of this series. So in this case, we have overflow because the size of this image is slightly bigger than the size of our container. So our container has round corners, so it ends here, but our image is bigger, so we have overflow. To solve this problem and bring back the round corners, we go to our container and set overflow to hidden. Now take a look. Perfect. We're done with this step. Next, we're going to handle touches. So now let's handle the touches. This is super easy. We have to wrap this container with a touchable component. In this case, I'm going to use a touchable without feedback, because when we tap on this container, we're going to see the image library, so there is no need for a second visual feedback. So here's our touchable. Now, whenever you import a touchable, always double check the import statement on top. Make sure you're importing from React Native, not React Native gesture handlers. So back to our touchable. We handle the onPress event and set this to a function called handlePress. Now let's implement the function. In this function, if we don't have an image, we're going to show the image library. To do that, I'm going to borrow the code we wrote earlier in this section. So in app.js, let's copy this function and paste it over here. Good. And then we call it if we don't have an image. Now here we're using image picker. So let's import it on the top. Import everything as image picker from expo-image picker. Now we have to make a couple of changes in this function. When launching the image library, I want to pass an object. This is a configuration object. If you press Ctrl and space, you can see all the properties of this object. All these properties are perfectly documented. In this video, we're going to use two of these properties. The first one is media types. So in this app, we only want to allow the user to select an image, not a video. So we set media types to image picker dot media type options dot images. The second property is quality, which is a number between 0 to 1. 1 means the highest quality, 0 means the lowest quality. In this case, I'm going to go with 0.5, so we get something in the mid-range, because later on, when we upload this image to the server, we don't want to deal with a large upload, okay? That was the first change. The second change is over here. Here we're trying to update our local state variable, but in this component, we already have a prop called image URI. It doesn't make sense to have both a prop and a state variable for the same purpose. So the component that uses our image input should be responsible for maintaining state. This is the same approach we took in the first part of the series. So when we used a text input or a picker component, that is where we define state. So here I'm going to add a second prop, onChange image. This is an event that this component is going to raise. So over here, when the user selects an image, we're going to call onChange image and notify the consumer of this component that the image is changed. And here we pass the URI to that image. Okay. Now, let's go back to app.js and handle the onChange event. So we set this to a function. This function takes the URI of the new image, and this is where we update the state. So we call setImageURI and give it a new URI. Okay. Now we no longer need these two components. So delete. Back to our component. So if we don't have an image, we got to show the image library. Otherwise, we want to show an alert and ask the user if they want to delete the image. I'm not going to use the alert function because I want to customize the buttons on this alert box. So let's import the alert component of React Native. Now the first argument is the title of our dialog box. Let's set that to delete. Here's our message. Are you sure you want to delete this image? And the third argument is the array of buttons. So here we pass an object. Let's press Ctrl and space. Here are the properties of this button. I'm going to set the text to yes. And onPress to, we should set this to a function. So when the user deletes this image, we don't want to physically delete it from the library. We just want to remove it from the container. So here we should call onChange image and pass null for the URI. We're telling the consumer of this component that there is no image inside the container. Okay. And for our second button, we're going to set the text to no. Now, let's test our implementation. So here's our image. Tap. Do you want to delete it? No. Nothing happens. Good. Let's try one more time and delete the image. Perfect. Let's select a new image. Our component is working properly. There is just one more piece I want to add here. We want this component to be completely reusable. So wherever we use this, I want this component to take care of getting users' permission. I don't want to remember to explicitly ask the user's permission. So let's go to app.js and copy the request permission function. We paste it over here. Now we're going to use our effect hook. So use effect. We give it a function. We want this function to be called only once. So we pass an empty array. In this function, we're going to get the user's permission. So now we have a reusable image input component. Let's move on to the next step. Now we want to build a component for selecting multiple images. So let's add a new file. We're going to call this image input list.js. Here's our component. In this container, we want to lay out our image inputs horizontally. So for this container, we should set flex direction. Now what props do we need here? Well, this interface is a collection of image inputs. So here we should have image URIs, which we can set to an empty array by default. Now we want to map these to a bunch of image input components. So basic React. We type image URIs.map. We get this URI and map it to an image input component. Now here we should set image URI to this URI and onChange image to. Now what should we do when this image is changed? Well, currently we don't have the functionality to replace an image. So if you have an image inside an image input and the change event is raised, that means the user has deleted that image. So here we should handle deletion. But just like the image input component, we don't want to maintain local state here. We want to have the state somewhere else inside our form. So here we need to add two more props on remove image and on add image. So if you add or remove an image from this list, we're going to raise these two events, okay? So here we pass a function and call on remove image with this URI, okay? Now, because we're using the map method, here we should also set the key prop that is just basic React. So we're going to set it to the URI of this image. So we're done with this part. Now, after these images, we always want to have an image input for adding a new image. So over here, one more time, we're going to use our image input component. Here we're going to handle the onChange event. So if this event is raised, that means the user has added a new image. So we get the URI of that image, and here we call onAddImage with that URI. So once again, we're not maintaining local state here. We're just raising events. Now let's test our app. So save the changes. We go to app.js. I'm going to delete all the code that we have written except this state variable. So we don't need any of these functions. Now we should rename this variable to image URIs because we're dealing with a list of URIs. And let's initialize this to an empty array. Now instead of image input, we're going to use image input list. Let's rename this prop to image URIs. And instead of onChange image, we're going to handle onAddImage and onRemove image. So on add image, what should we do here? We get the URI of the new image. Then we should add that to our state variable. But we're not going to write that code here in line. We're going to write it inside a separate function called handle add that takes the URI. Now, whenever you see this pattern in your code, like you have a parameter, then you call a function and pass that parameter, you can simplify your code by simply using the name of the function. So here we can just type handle add. Because handle add is going to be a function that takes the URI and does something with it. So there is no need to define a separate inline function here, okay? So here's handle add. Now let's implement it. So handle add takes the URI. Now we should add this to our array of URIs. Again, this is basic React. So I'm going to call setImageURIs. Using the spread operator, I'm going to take a copy of our original array and then add the URI at the end. Pretty basic. Now, what about deletion? Very similar. So here we handle onRemoveImage. Here we take a URI, and then we should pass it to a function like handleRemove, like this. Again, we have this repetitive pattern in our code, so we can simplify it by simply typing the name of the function. Now, let's implement this function. So how are we going to remove this from our array? There are a few different ways to do this. I'm going to use the filter method. So first we call setImageURIs. Now we go to our original array. We want to get all URIs except the one that we get here. So we use the filter method, give it a function. This function takes ImageURI. Now here we type a Boolean expression. ImageURI does not equal to URI. Again, basic React. Now let's test our implementation. So let's add an image. Good. Now we can add another image to this list, but we need some margin here. So back to our component. Now this image input currently doesn't support a style property. We can extend it and give it this feature, but I think this is unnecessary. There is a simpler solution. We can wrap this inside a view and apply the styles to that view. So let's add a view here. Now we should set the key prop on this view because that is the container. Now we set the style to styles.image. And this part is super easy. For this image, we set margin right to, let's say, 10 pixels. So now we have a bit of margin here. Let's add a second image. Okay, good. What about another image? Perfect. Now I'm going to delete the first image. Perfect. One more. Okay. Our component is ready. So now let's move on to the next step. So I've added 4 images, but now we have a problem. Can you tell what the problem is? The camera icon is gone, so we cannot add a new image. To solve this problem, we need to enable horizontal scrolling. This is really easy to implement. We just have to wrap this view inside a scroll view component. So let's add a scroll view here. Once again, we have 2 implementations. One implementation comes from React Native Gesture Handler. The other comes from React Native. This is the implementation we're going to use. So here's our scroll view. Now, by default, we get a vertical scroll bar. We can change that to horizontal by setting horizontal to true. Or we can use the shorthand syntax and just type the name of the prop, so we don't have to set the value. Now, take a look. So we can scroll, beautiful. Let me show you something. Let's add a new image. Wouldn't that be nicer if the moment I added this new image, this component automatically scrolled to the end? Let me show you how to implement this. Here's the documentation for the scroll view component on React Native website. Now over here, you can see the methods of this component. Here we have this method, scroll to end. If we have a vertical scroll view, this will scroll to the bottom. If we have a horizontal scroll view, this will scroll to the right. But how can we call a method on this component? Using the ref hook. So using the ref hook, we can get a reference to an instance of a component. Let me show you. So here we call useRef. This is defined in React. Take a look. This is a function defined in React. It's a hook. So we call this and get a reference object. So let's store that here. Now we need to link this object with this scroll view over here. To do that, here we set the ref prop to scroll view. As simple as that. Now, if we type scroll view.current, we get access to this instance of scroll view. So here we can call its method, like scroll to end. Unfortunately, here we don't get IntelliSense because this useRef returns a general purpose reference object. It doesn't know that we're talking to a scroll view, okay? So this is how we can call a method on this component. But where is the right place to call this method? Well, this component as a prop. It's actually an event. It's called onContentSize change. So when the size of this container changes, this event gets raised, and this is the moment we want to scroll to the end. So here we pass a function, and then call this method. Okay, now let's save the changes. So here's the end result. Let's test our app. So I'm going to add a new image. And here's our automatic scrolling. Beautiful. Now there is one tiny issue with this component. Let me show you. So let's apply a background color to the scroll view. So as a temporary solution, I just want to apply an inline style here. Background color, yellow. Now take a look. See what happened? The reason this is happening is that by default, the scroll view grows to fill all the available space. This can totally mess up with our listing edit form later on. So when we add this component to our listing edit form, the scroll view is going to push down the other fields on the form so it can take all the available space. To solve this problem, we need to wrap this inside a view. As I told you before, by default, the size of a view is determined by the size of its content. So this view will grow enough to fit these components. Let me show you. So here we add a view. Okay, now take a look. Our scroll view is no longer growing more than it should. So let's go back and remove this background color. All right, we're done with this component. Let's move on to the next step. All right, our component is ready. Now we're going to add this to a form. So we need to combine it with an error message inside a new component. This is exactly the same technique we used in the first part of this course. So earlier we created these components, form field, which renders a text box inside a form, and form picker, which renders a drop-down list inside a form. Now we want to add a new component. I'm going to call this form imagePicker.js. So here's our component. Now in this component, we're not going to use this view. So delete. That means we don't need the styles object either. And let's also delete this line. So here we're going to add an image input list and an error message. Note that we have multiple implementations. We're going to use the implementation in the current folder. That is the implementation that belongs to our project. We also have an implementation in Formic. We're not going to use that one here. So here's our error message. Now, because we have multiple components, we need to wrap them inside a fragment. Okay. Now, let's set image URIs to, what are we going to use here? Well, in this component, we're not going to have local state because Formic is going to maintain our form state. So here we should use Formic context to get access to the state for this field and then pass it as a prop. So to save time, I'm going to go to form picker and borrow some code. We're going to copy this line, the line where we use Formic context. So copy, paste it over here. Now we need to import Formic context. So import, use Formic context from Formic. Now while you're here, let's also sort these import statements. That's better. So with Formic context, we get access to the values object. As you know, this object has all the values for our form. Now here we only want to get the value for this particular field. So let's give this component a new prop, name. And here we get values of name. I'm using the same technique we used in the first part of this course. So if what I'm showing you is foreign to you, you really have to go back and watch the first part. So here's the image URIs. Now we should handle the two events. On add image, we set this to handle add. And on remove image, we set it to handle remove. Now to save time, let's borrow some code from our app component. So we go to app.js. We're going to copy these two functions, handle add and remove. Now let's paste them over here. We need to make a couple of changes to this function. First of all, we're not going to call this function set image URIs because earlier we used this to update our local state. But here we don't have local state. Our state is maintained by Formic. So here we should tell Formic to update the value for this field. To do that, we're going to use this function, set field value. This function has two parameters, name and value. For the name parameter, I'm going to use the name prop here, and here's our value, the updated array, okay? Now here we have a reference to image URIs. This is the state variable we defined in our app component. We have to get the value from the values object. So values of name. Now we have to make the same changes to this other function. So here we call setFieldValue, pass the name, and replace image URIs with values of name. Now, because we have used this expression multiple times, we could give it an alias to make our code more readable. So I'm going to define a constant called image URIs and set it to values of name. Now, we're going to replace these three instances. Let me show you a cool technique. So I've selected this expression. Now we want to enable multi-cursor editing. If you're on Mac, press Command and D. If you're on Windows, press Control and D. Here's the second cursor. One more time. Here's the third cursor. Now we can replace all these instances in one go. So image URIs. Press Escape and we're done. So the last part is our error message component. Once again, to save time, I'm going to go to our form picker component and copy the code for the error message component. So let's replace this. So here's our form image picker. The next step is to add this to our listing edit form. We'll do that next. All right, here's listing edit screen. In this file, we have to apply a number of changes. First, our validation schema. In this object, we add a new property, images. This field is an array, so here we call yup.array. Now, I'm not going to call the required method because this property is never going to be null. We're going to initialize this to an empty array. So we just want to make sure that there is at least one object in this array. So here we call min and pass 1. Now we could call the label method to give this field a custom name, like images with a capital I. And with this, our error message would look like this. Images field is required. Now this error message doesn't quite work in the context of this form. It would be better to tell the user, hey, please select at least one image. So we don't really need the label method here. Instead, we're going to supply a second argument to the min method. This is the error that will be displayed if this rule is violated. So here we can say, please select at least one image. So here's our validation schema. Next, we have our categories. This code shouldn't really be here. It's polluting this file, but don't worry about it for now. We're going to get these categories from the server in the future. So let's move on to the next step. Here's our component. In this component, we have this form. Now look at the initial values object. In this object, we're going to add a new property, images. We set this to an empty array. This is the reason I told you that we don't need the required method because this property is never going to be null. Okay? Now, here's our title field. Right above this, I'm going to add a form image picker. Now, every field in this form should have the name prop. So we set the name to images. Now, to test this, we go to app.js. I'm going to remove all the code we have written. We don't need any of this stuff. We just need to return a listing edit screen. Now let's test our app. So if we submit the form, we get this message. Please select at least one image. Now let's select an image. The error is gone. What if I remove this image? The error is back. Beautiful. We're almost done with our listing edit screen. The last thing we want to add here is the location of the user's device. First, we should set the location of this simulator. So on the top, under the features menu, let's set the location to Apple. If you're using an Android virtual device, look at the exercises PDF in this section. I explain how to set this up for Android. Now, to get the user's location, we're going to use the location API in Expo. So let's install expo-location. All right, now back to our listing edit screen. On the top, let's import everything as location from expo-location. Now let me show you a shortcut. Under the Go menu, look at this command. Go to Symbol in Editor. The shortcut on Mac is Shift, Command, and O. With this, we can jump to different segments in this file. So we can jump to our validation schema, or to our categories, or to our component. Now, the first time this component is rendered, we want to get the user's location. So here we're going to use the effect hook, give it a function, and we want this to be executed only once, the first time. Now, this function, first we should get the user's permission. So we call location.request permissions async. Then we await the call and get the result. Now, earlier I told you that we cannot pass an async function to the effect hook, so we're going to move this logic somewhere else. Let's define a function called getLocation. This is an async function. Here we get the user's permission, and then call this new function over here. All right. Now, in this app, I defined location as optional. So if you have the user's location, we're going to post it to the server along with the listing. And then when we display the listing, we'll show the location on the map. If we don't have the location, we're not going to show it on the map. So location is optional. That's just the way I define this app. Now, here we're going to destructure the result object and pick the granted property. If the user doesn't grant permission, you're just going to return. Otherwise, we're going to get the user's location. So we call location.get last known position. We also have get current position, but this method can take several seconds. So for performance reasons, we're going to get the last known position. This is not as accurate as the current position, but it does the job for now. So let's call this, then await the call to get the result. Now this result object has a couple of properties: coordinates and timestamp. So let's destructure it right away to get the coordinates. The coordinates has a bunch of properties. Here we're only interested in latitude and longitude. So we can destructure this object straight away. We add a colon, then a pair of braces, and pick latitude and longitude. Now we need to store this somewhere. So let's use the state hook. We define a new state variable. Let's call that location. Now, when we get the user's location, we call setLocation and give it an object with two properties: latitude and longitude. That's all we had to do. Now, when we submit this form, over here, we should have access to the user's location. So to verify that, let's log the location. Now, let's quickly test the app. So I'm going to select an image and fill out this form. Okay, take a look. So here's the location. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to improve this code and make it better. So here's how we get the user's location. Now, what if somewhere else in this app, let's say on another screen, we need to know the user's location? Then we'd have to repeat all this code there. Now, in this case, this is a hypothetical scenario. We don't have another screen with this requirement. But I thought this is a good time to talk about custom hooks. Using a custom hook, we can encapsulate some state and some logic around that state inside a single reusable function. Let me show you how it works. So inside the app folder, let's add a new folder called hooks. Now here we add a new file called use location. So all hooks should start with use. That's a common convention. Now here we define a function, just a regular JavaScript function. So const use location is a function. We could also define this using the function declaration syntax. It doesn't matter. Now, let's export this from this module. We could also combine these two statements into a single statement. So here we can say export default. That's better. Now in this function, we're going to add all the code that we wrote in the last lesson. So back to our listing edit screen, we're going to take our state as well as the logic around that state. So the get location function, as well as where we use the effect hook. So let's take all this code, cut it, and then move it to our new function. So here we have a regular JavaScript function. There is nothing magical about this. We just have some code that we're going to reuse in multiple places. Now, because this is just a regular JavaScript function, we can decide what we want to return from this function. In this case, I want to return the user's location. So at the end, we return the location. What we have here is called a custom hook. So a custom hook encapsulates some state and some logic around that state in a single place. Now we can reuse this hook in multiple places. But before we do that, let's fix something here real quick. So here we're awaiting these calls, but what if this promise, the promise that we get from this method, isn't resolved? Then we'd end up with an unresolved promise. So we should wrap this code inside a try-catch block. So try-catch, and then move all this code there. Okay. So in this catch block, for now, let's just log the error. Now, before we move on, let's import the location API on the top. So import everything as location from expo-location. Also, we're using the state and effect hooks. So let's import them. Here's the state hook, and here's the effect hook. We're done here. Now, back to our listing edit screen. Here we can simply call our custom hook and get the user's location. As simple as that. So if somewhere else in this app we need to get the user's location, all we have to do is to import and call this function. Now let's test our app. So one more time, I'm going to fill out this form. And here's my location in the terminal. Beautiful. So with this, let's go to the top and remove the unused import statements. Good. And good. Done. In this section, you're going to learn how to implement navigation in your apps. As part of this, we're going to take our app to the next level. So now we have these beautiful tabs down here. We can navigate between different screens. We can tap on a card and see the details for a screen. We can pull this down. So our app is becoming more functional. I'm super excited about this section. I hope you are too. So let's jump in and get started. To implement navigation in our app, we're going to use a popular library called React Navigation. You can find their documentation at reactnavigation.org. The latest version at the time of recording this video is version 5, which is kind of different from the previous versions. So let's have a quick look at the installation instructions. First, we have to install this library at React Navigation/native. So let's copy this line, paste it in our terminal window, and here I want to add version 5. Please use the same version so you can easily follow the course. Let's go with this. So here I'm using React Navigation version 5.3.2. Now back to the documentation. We should also install a bunch of third-party libraries like React Native Gesture Handler, React Native Reanimated, and so on. Now, since we're using this in a managed Expo project, we need to install these using Expo. As you know, Expo makes sure that the version we're installing is compatible with the current version of Expo we're using. So let's copy this line, paste it in the terminal window, and install them. All right, we have installed all of these libraries. Now, if you're using this in a bare React Native project, or if in the future you decide to eject from Expo, you need to install these libraries using npm. And then you have to perform some additional steps. All of these are documented here. In React Navigation, we have 3 types of navigators. We have Stack Navigator for taking the user from one screen to another. It's very similar to the navigation built into web browsers, so we can push or pop screens from the stack. We also have Tab Navigator for implementing tabs, and Drawer Navigator for implementing a drawer that we can pull from the left side of the screen. All these navigators are very similar. They have the same interface. So once you learn how to use one of them, you can easily learn about the others. In this course, we're going to use Stack and Tab Navigators because we're going to need them in our app. So I will leave it up to you to learn about Drawer Navigator on your own. So next, I'm going to show you how to work with a stack navigator. Here on React Navigation website, let's look at this page. Hello, React Navigation. So as you can see, first we have to install the Stack Navigator library. So each navigator is implemented in a separate library. Here we're going to use a Stack Navigator. So we have to install this library, copy this, and paste it in the terminal. So the version I'm using is version 5.3.5. Now, I've simplified the code in our app component because we want to take a break from our app and study React Navigation in isolation. So on the top, I'm just importing React and the text component from React Native. And after that, I'm importing the screen component that we built earlier in the course. This makes sure that our content is in the safe area. Now let's create a couple of components for studying navigation. So tweets. Let's imagine with this component, we're going to show a list of tweets to the user. So a basic function component, we add a screen, and then inside the screen, we add a text component, say tweets. Let's also create tweet details. So in the future, when we tap on a tweet, we're going to go to the tweet details screen. So one more time, screen, text, and here we say tweet details. Okay. So now we have two components. Let's create a stack navigator. On the top, we're going to import a function called create stack navigator from the library that we just installed at React Navigation/stack. Okay. Now we're going to call this function create stack navigator. This gives us an object. Let's call that stack. Now this object has a couple of properties, navigator and screen, and both of these are React components. That is why I named this object using the Pascal naming convention, because we're going to use this like a React component. So let's create another component called stack navigator. Now look at the naming convention. Here we have stack, and then we have stack navigator. This is the convention that I like to follow. It makes your code really clean and maintainable. So once again, we create a function component. First, we add stack.navigator. Then we add a bunch of screen components. With these screen components, we can define our routes. So stack.screen. Here's our first route. We give it a unique name, like tweets, and the component that should be rendered when we are at this route. That is our tweets component. Let's duplicate this. For our second route, we're going to call this tweet details, and our component is going to be tweet details as well. So now that we have a navigator, we need to wrap this inside a navigation container. So on the top, we're going to import a component called navigation container from @React Navigation/native. So this component is defined in the main library, but this function is defined in the stack library. Now, other navigators like tab and drawer navigators, they have the same structure. You'll see that soon. So back to our app component. Here we're going to return a navigation container. And inside this container, we're going to use our stack navigator component. So stack navigator. Here's what you need to take away here. Instead of rendering specific screens like tweets or tweet details, we're going to render our stack navigator component. This component knows how to navigate between different screens. So let's save the changes and see what we get. Because we're using a stack navigator, we get this header on the top. We can fully customize this. We can change the background or foreground color. We can change the style of this text. We can add buttons to the left or right side of this header. We have a whole lot of control over this header. Now here by default, we see the tweet screen because that's the first screen or the first route we have defined in our navigator. If I swap the order of the screens, now we have to manually reload the app because the navigator is maintaining the navigation state. So reload. Now the initial screen is the tweet details screen. We can change that by setting this prop. Initial route name, we set it to tweets. Now let's reload one more time. Now our front screen is the tweet screen. So these names that we use here, they should uniquely identify our route, and by default, what we specify here will be used as the title of the header bar. We can always change that later. So let's simplify this code. We don't need this prop. And let's move the tweet screen first. Next, I'm going to show you how to take the user from one screen to another. Let's see how we can take the user from one screen to another. So here in the tweets component, let's add a button. I'm going to set the title to view tweet and onPress to a function. Now, when the user taps on this button, we want to take them to the tweet details screen. So React Navigation gives our screen components a special prop called navigation. So here's the props object. We can destructure this and pick the navigation property. Now here, we pass a function, and in this function we call navigation.navigate. And here we specify the name of the target route or the target screen. So tweet details. Take a look. So here's our button. Now we're on the tweet details screen. We also have this back button on the top. Beautiful. Now, if you're curious about this navigation prop, you can read about it on React Navigation documentation. So here under API reference, we have navigation prop. Here's the navigation object. We have these methods here. We looked at the navigate method. We also have reset, go back, and so on. Now, all these methods are common across different types of navigators. Each navigator type has some additional methods. For example, if we use a static navigator, our navigation object has these 4 additional methods. We have replace for replacing the current route with a new one, push for pushing a new route onto the stack, pop for going back in the stack, and pop to top for going to the top of the stack. Now, one thing that a lot of beginners get confused about is the difference between push and navigate methods. The navigate method makes sure that we have a single instance of this route or this screen on our stack. So let's change this to tweets and see what happens. Take a look. So tap, tap, nothing happens because we're already on this screen. So we have a single instance of this screen on our stack. Now, if I change this to push and tap, look, we got our back button because now we have 2 instances of the tweet screen on our stack. Okay, so that is the difference between push and navigate methods. Also, one thing you need to know is that this navigation prop is only available on our screen components. So the components that we declare as a screen over here. That means if you have another component, a child component inside the tweets component, that component is not going to have access to the navigation prop. But we can use the navigation hook to get access to the navigation object. Let me show you. So I'm going to create a new component here. Link, just a basic function component. Here I'm going to add a button. Let's set the title to click and onPress to a function. Now let's say when the user taps on this link, we want to take them to the tweet details screen. Here we don't have access to the navigation prop because link is not a screen, it's just a component. So let's add a block of code here. Now in this function, we're going to have this return statement. And before that, we're going to use the navigation hook of React Navigation. So this function is defined in React Navigation/native. It's right here. When we call this, we get access to the navigation object. So here's our navigation object. It's not available as a prop. And now we can call navigation.navigate to tweet details. Save the changes. Now we can use this component on our tweet screen. So let me replace the button with the link. Okay, take a look. Everything works exactly like before. Next, I'm going to show you how to pass parameters. So in our tweets component, we have this button. When we tap on it, we want to see the details for a specific tweet. This is where we need to pass a parameter to the target screen. This navigate method has an optional second parameter. We pass an object And in this object, we can pass one or more key value pairs. For example, we can pass the ID of this tweet, or we can pass the entire tweet object. Now we can access this object in our target screen. So here's the target screen. We have another special prop called route. So React Navigation automatically injects this prop to all our screen components. Now, if you're in the child component, we don't have access to the route prop. There, we need to use the route hook. This returns the same route object, okay? Now, let's render route.params. This returns the same object that we passed over here. So we're going to render route.params.id. Take a look. So let's go to our tweet. And here's the ID of the target tweet. Next, we're going to talk about setting screen titles. So as we have noticed, the title of this screen is based on the name of the route. What if we want to change the title here? Well, this screen component has another prop called options. We set this to an object, and here we can set the title to, let's say, tweet details with a space. Take a look. Here's our new title. Now, what if we want to set this dynamically based on the data in our route parameters? Well, this options prop, we can either set it to an object or a function that returns an object. So I'm going to pass a function here. Now we have to wrap these braces inside parentheses, otherwise they will be interpreted as a block of code. We don't want to have a block of code here. We just want to return an object. So we wrap this in parentheses. Now, React Navigation automatically injects the route prop here, so we can get it, and then use it while setting the title. So route.params.id. Take a look. So this is how we can set the title dynamically. Next, I'm going to show you how to customize the header bar. Let's talk about customizing the header. So here's our tweet screen. Now, in the last lesson, you learned about the options object. Now, this object has a bunch of properties we can use to customize the header. We can set header style to a style object. Here we can set the background color to tomato. Now, here's what we get. We can also change the color of the text here. So we set header tint color to white. Here's what we get. Another useful property is header shown. We can set it to false. Now the header disappears. Now, one thing you need to understand here is that these styles are only applied to the tweet screen. So if we go to the tweet details screen, all the options we set disappear, but we can apply them globally to our navigator. So here's our stack navigator. We can set screen options to an object. This object supports the same properties we have here. So I'm going to copy these, paste them here. Let's remove header shown and set background color to Dodger blue. So here are the default styles we apply to all the screens in our app. Now, if you want, we can always override these styles for specific screens. Take a look. So by default, we have this blue header, but if you go to the tweet screen, the header is gone. Now, if you're curious about the list of properties you can set, here on the documentation, under navigators, look at create stack navigator. Now here on the top, select options. You can find all properties and their description. They're perfectly documented. Next, we're going to talk about tabs. Let's see how we can add tabs to our app. So here on reactnavigation.org, in the documentation, under navigators, you can see create bottom tab navigator. To use this navigator, first we have to install React Navigation/native, which we have done before. But in addition to this library, we should also install React Navigation/bottom tabs, because earlier I told you that each navigator is implemented in a separate library. So let's copy this line and install this library. So here I'm using version 5.4.4. Now, in app.js, similar to creating a stack navigator, we're going to import a function from React Navigation. So import create bottom tab navigator from React Navigation / bottom tabs. We're going to follow a very similar pattern. So down to bottom, here's our app component. First, I'm going to call this function create bottom tab navigator. This gives us an object. Let's call it tab. Now tab has two properties, navigator and screen, exactly like the stack object we created earlier. So now we have to create a tab navigator similar to this stack navigator. So let's create a new component, tab navigator. First we add tab.navigator. Now inside this navigator, we're going to have a bunch of screen components. So tab.screen, each screen here represents a tab in our app. So we give it a name, let's say feed, and a component to render when the tab becomes active. So let's use our tweets component. Now I'm going to add a second tab. Let's call it account. Now we don't have an account component, so I'm going to create it real quick. Account as a component. Here we're going to return our screen, and inside the screen we're going to add some text and say account. Now let's use that over here. Finally, in our app, instead of the stack navigator, we're going to use the tab navigator. As simple as that. Take a look. So now we have these two tabs down below, feed and account. Just like the header, we have a lot of control over customizing the tabs. I'm going to show you how to do that next. So here we have a couple of tabs. Now let's make them pretty. This navigator component, it has a prop called tab bar options. So earlier we had screen options. Now we have tab bar options. That's why I told you these navigators, they're very similar. They have the same interface. So once you learn how to use one of them, you can easily learn about the others. Now in this object, I'm going to set a bunch of properties. Active background color, let's set it to tomato. Active tint color, let's set it to white. Now let's take a look. So here's the active tab, looks pretty good. We also have a couple of properties for the inactive tabs. So we can set inactive background color to light gray and inactive tint color to black. So our inactive tab has a light gray background. Now what about icons? Well, that is super easy. First, we import one of the icon sets. So import, let's say material community icons from @expo/vector icons. Now, for each screen or each tab, we need to define a different icon. So, for example, for our first tab, we set the options to an object. This object has a property called tab bar icon. We have a lot of other properties. You can read about them on the documentation. So let's set tab bar icon to a function component. So here we return material community icons, and let's set the name to home. Let's see what we get. So here's the icon. It looks very small. So let's make it bigger. Let's say 25. It's better. We can also destructure this prop and get the size that React Navigation suggests. So we can use that here. Often that is more appropriate. That looks pretty good. Now, what about the color? With the active tab, the text is white, so the icon should be white as well. To do that, we're going to destructure the props here and pick the color property. Now, React Navigation will tell us what color we should set based on the colors we define here. So let's set the color to color. And here's the final result. That looks pretty good. So customizing tabs is really easy. Next, we're going to talk about nesting navigators. So I've removed the styles that we applied in the previous lesson. Now let me show you a problem with this implementation. Currently, we're on the feed tab. If you go to the tweet details screen, we get this error. The action navigate with this payload was not handled by any navigator. Here's the reason. In our app component, currently we have a single navigator, the tab navigator, which knows about these two screens. So our app doesn't know about the tweet detail screen. That is why we got that error. But this is really easy to fix using a technique called nesting navigators. So in our tab navigator, this screen is associated with the tweets component. We can replace this component with the stack navigator that we created earlier. So stack navigator. Now back to our app. We're on the first tab. We can look at the details for this tweet. Beautiful. We can go to the account tab. Now this tab can also have its own stack navigator. And quite often that is the case in most real apps because each tab should maintain its navigation state. So currently we're on the account tab. If we go back to the feed tab, we want to see the last screen that we visited before we switch to the account tab. That is why each tab should have its own stack navigator. Now in this case, stack navigator is a very general name. It would be better to rename this to something more specific, like feed navigator. Now it's clear that this navigator is for the feed tab. By the same token, we could have a navigator for the account tab. We would call that account navigator. So this is what we call nesting navigators. Now it's time for an exercise. I want you to implement navigation in this app. So now we have these beautiful tabs down here. We can navigate between different screens. We can tap on a card and see the details of a listing. We can pull this down. So our app is becoming more functional. So just like before, download the PDF I've attached here, read the details, and try to implement these features step by step. So spend 30 to 40 minutes on this. When you're done, come back, see my solution. All right, the first step is to implement the navigation flow for authentication. So here in the app folder, let's add a new folder called navigation. All our navigation code is going to be encapsulated in this folder. So here we're going to add a new file called authnavigator.js. First, we need to import create stack navigator from React Navigation /stack. Okay. Now we call this function. We get an object. Let's call it stack. And with this, we can create our authnavigator object. So authnavigator is a React component. We start with stack.navigator. Now inside this navigator, we're going to have three screens. So stack.screen. The first screen is our welcome screen. So we set the name to welcome and the component to welcome screen. Let's duplicate this. The second screen is our login screen. And here's the component. And finally, the third screen is the register screen. And here's the component. Now, because we're using JSX here, we need to import React on the top. So IMR is short for import React. Now let's separate our import statements just like before and sort them. That makes our code cleaner. Finally, let's export the auth navigator object. So export default auth navigator. We're done with this step. Now we should go to the welcome screen. So here's our login button. When the user taps on this button, we need to take them to the login screen. So first we're going to get the navigation object. And then we're going to handle the onPress event. And this function we call navigation.navigate to login. Now I'm going to copy this code and paste it for our register button. Okay, we're almost there. The final step. We need to go to our app component. And instead of this tab navigator that we created earlier in this section, we're going to use our auth navigator. Let's take a look. So here's our welcome screen. Now we have this header on the top, which is kind of weird. We have to get rid of it. But before we do that, let's make sure our navigation works. So let's go to the login screen. Beautiful. Now we have this gray background. This is because of the default theme that comes with React Navigation. We're going to override that in the next video. For now, let's focus on the navigation flow. So back to the welcome screen. Let's go to the register screen. Good. So we want to get rid of this header. That is very easy. We go to our auth navigator. Here's our welcome screen. Let's set the options to an object. And here we set header shown to false. Now let's test our app. Okay, the header is gone. So next we're going to build our own navigation theme.